Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have a great show for you tonight. One of my mentors and a longtime activist from the 60s, Michael Aldrich, is on tonight. Michael has been working for marijuana legalization since the 1960s. So look forward to a great interview with a lot of fascinating information about the history of marijuana reform. We have an interesting hip news segment for you tonight beforehand, but first, as we always do, we'll bring on our infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Welcome to our hip news segment. From Virginia, last week, a majority of the Virginia legislature concurred with Governor Northam's recommendation to change adult use legalization bills on his desk. This means that beginning July 1st of this year, adults in Virginia will be permitted to possess up to 1 ounce of marijuana and to cultivate up to 4 cannabis plants per household without penalty, rather than January of 2024, which is what the previous enactment date was, initially approved by lawmakers last month. Governor Northam had objected and said that had to be moved up, and thank goodness they did. The timeline by which state regulators have to enact provisions licensing commercial cannabis production and sales remains July 1st, 2024. Newly released statewide polling data finds that 68% of registered voters in Virginia, including majorities of Democrats and Republicans, support legalizing marijuana for adults. Virginians were very clear that they are ready for legalization this year, sending over 8,800 emails in support of these measures. Additional amendments added by Governor Northam will allow the sealing of records related to crimes involving the misdemeanor possession of marijuana with the intent to distribute. Those records will begin to be sealed starting on July 1st. Separate legislation enacted in 2020 previously sealed records related to misdemeanor marijuana possession. In recent days, Virginia's Governor Northam has approved multiple medical marijuana measures permitting dispensaries to provide botanical formulations of cannabis flowers, expanding telehealth access for patients, and protecting registered patients who use cannabis in their off hours from discrimination in the workplace, something we need here in Oregon. In total, Virginia's Governor Northam has approved 41 pro-cannabis bills during his term in office. In Virginia, the governor's just limited to a single 4-year term. On Monday, April 12th, New Mexico's Democratic Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham signed 2 separate measures into law amending the state's marijuana policies. The first measure, House Bill 2, legalizes and regulates marijuana possession, production, and sales for adults. The second measure, Senate Bill 2, facilitates the automatic review and expungement of the records of those convicted of low-level marijuana offenses. Lawmakers approved both bills during a special legislative session demanded by Governor Lujan Grisham, who had been a vocal proponent of these reforms. New Mexico joins an ever-growing list of states that have realized the failures of marijuana prohibition and the harms it brings to their communities and citizens. The American people are demanding an end to prohibitionist policies that have wreaked havoc on communities of color, squandered countless millions or billions of dollars in taxpayer money, and wasted limited judicial and law enforcement resources on criminalizing otherwise law-abiding individuals for possession of a product that's objectively less harmful than alcohol or tobacco. The adult use measure in New Mexico, House Bill 2, permits those aged 21 and older to legally purchase up to 2 ounces of marijuana and or 16 grams of cannabis extract from local dispensaries, and to home cultivate up to 6 mature marijuana plants for their own. There's no limit on the immature plants. Retail sales would begin in April 2022. Activities involving the personal possession and cultivation of cannabis are depenalized on June 29th this year, the date and the new law takes effect. The expungement measure, Senate Bill 2, stipulates that those with past convictions for offenses made legal under this act are eligible for automatic expungement of their records. Those currently incarcerated for such offenses are eligible for a dismissal of their sentences. It's estimated that over 150,000 New Mexico residents are eligible for automatic expungement under this measure, according to New Mexico's Department of Public Safety. In Washington, D.C., the Biden administration has announced its intention to nominate Ann Milgram, who formerly served as New Jersey's Attorney General, to the position of DEA Administrator. If confirmed, Milgram will be the first DEA Administrator to have been confirmed by the Senate since the presidency of Barack Obama. Former President Donald Trump previously relied on administrators who were serving in an acting capacity. America has begun to fully rethink our ongoing failed practices of over-policing and incarceration that have categorized our racist war on drugs for decades, and our nation needs the next administrator of the DEA to be someone who acknowledges the need for reform, including the legalization of marijuana. During her tenure as the Garden State's Attorney General under then New Jersey Governor John Corzine, Milgram offered cautioned support for the state's medicinal marijuana program when legislation to approve it was passed in 2010. In the South, the Mississippi Supreme Court hears oral arguments today in a legal challenge that seeks to nullify a November vote legalizing the production and dispensing of medical cannabis to qualified patients. On Election Day in November 2020, 73% of Mississippi voters decided in favor of Measure 65, which establishes a system of state-licensed dispensaries to engage in the retail dispensing of cannabis and cannabis products to patients who possess a doctor's authorization. Just prior to the vote, officials representing the city of Madison, Mississippi, including the town's mayor, filed suit arguing that the legislature's failure to update guidelines for petitioners should invalidate the initiative vote. Specifically, state statutes call for petitioners to gather an equal percentage of signatures from 5 congressional districts. However, following redistricting 20 years ago, there are only 4 congressional districts in Mississippi. Lawmakers since that time have failed to update the statute, and numerous initiatives passed with just the 4 congressional districts. This is the first time anyone complained. Of course, it'd be about cannabis. After decades of enslaving and imprisoning us peaceful cannabis users, legalization opponents have shown that now, time and time again, that they cannot succeed in either the court of public opinion or at the ballot box. Thus, they're now asking judges to set aside the votes of over 1 million Americans in a desperate effort to override undisputed election outcomes. Whether or not one supports marijuana legalization, Americans should be outraged at these overtly undemocratic tactics, and the court should reject them. If the vote's affirmed by Mississippi Supreme Court, Mississippi will be the 36th state to legalize medical cannabis access. As the country moves forward with sweeping changes in cannabis policy reform, locals in Delaware are tangling with corporate multi-state medical marijuana permit holders to pass a bill for full legalization. Adult use activists and registered medical patients were stunned to hear opposing testimony from Delaware's medical marijuana operators. Patients already deal with limited access and costly products, up to $500 an ounce. Now many see the established industry voicing opposition as simply obstructing the progress of adult use legalization. In response, some patients are now staging a boycott of the regulated dispensaries. During the first committee hearing for HB 150, Delaware's adult use bill, 4 of the state's 6 currently licensed multi-million-dollar medical cannabis facilities offered negative testimony. These included publicly traded Columbia Care, Fresh Delaware, Canatech Research, and the owner of EZY Venture, otherwise known as The Farm. They all went on record condemning HB 150 in Delaware and pushing a false narrative about oversupply. The core demand from the permit cartel was some protection for their private business interests with guaranteed adult use licenses. The company's greed and desire for market control is what's harming medical patients. The lack of affordable cannabis in sufficient quantities to meet the demand is causing patients to suffer. These dispensaries have failed to produce results and have been allotted more than adequate time to produce results. They do not deserve nor hold the credentials to be the first to receive new licenses to empower their greedy corporate interests. In California, licensed cannabis retailers in California are vigorously enforcing rules prohibiting young people's entry into their facilities if they fail to show proof of age, according to a study commissioned by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety and the University of Chicago. Researchers assessed whether retail cannabis facilities would service pseudo-underage buyers who failed to show proof of age. All 47 of the randomly selected California retailers denied the patrons entry. The authors concluded, quote, at 100% of the recreational marijuana outlets visited, the pseudo-underage patrons were required to show age identification to enter. It appears that California's recreational marijuana outlets avoid selling to underage customers, end quote. The results are similar to those documented in other states, like here in Oregon and Colorado, where inspections have similarly found that nearly all retailers are compliant with age restriction requirements. Regulation works. Illicit marijuana providers don't ask for or check IDs, but licensed businesses most certainly do. On a nationwide level, tax revenue from state legal cannabis sales rose significantly in 2020, according to an analysis by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. The authors reported, quote, powered by an expanding legal market and a pandemic-driven boost in cannabis use, excise and sales taxes on cannabis jumped by more than $1 billion in 2020, or 58% compared to a year earlier. In total, these taxes raised more than $3 billion last year, including $1 billion in California alone. Transactions specific to the commercial market in California were responsible for over 1/3 of the nation's total cannabis tax growth in 2020. Year over year, cannabis tax revenue rose by some 40% in California. Significant growth in revenue also occurred in 2020 in states with more established markets, such as Oregon, Colorado, and Washington. The authors of the study emphasized that these tax revenues are among the state's fastest growing revenue sources. Illinois took in more tax dollars from marijuana than alcohol for the first time last quarter, according to Illinois' Department of Revenue. From January to March, Illinois generated about $86,500,000 in adult use marijuana tax revenue, compared to $72,281,000 from liquor sales. The following the cannabis market in Illinois might not be entirely surprised, as the state has consistently been reporting record-breaking sales, even amid the pandemic. In March alone, adults spent $109 million on recreational cannabis products in Illinois, the largest single month of sales since the retailers opened shop. At a local level, a legislative committee of the Philadelphia, PA City Council approved a bill to ban pre-employment drug testing for marijuana by anyone in the city of Philadelphia. From a corporate level, the CEO of Uber, the ride-sharing app, said on Monday that the ride-share company will, quote, absolutely explore adding marijuana deliveries to its services when federal prohibition ends, end quote. Dara Khosrowshahi, the CEO of Uber, was asked about the prospect of expanding his business to include cannabis deliveries during an interview with CNBC. He said while the company remains focused on grocery and alcohol deliveries, in addition to its core ride-sharing service, that's certainly in the cards if marijuana is federally legalized. On a national level as well, legalizing marijuana for adult use is associated with an increase in workforce productivity and decrease in workplace injuries, according to a new study partly funded by the federal government. In a working paper published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, the researchers looked at the impact of recreational cannabis legalization on workers' compensation claims among older adults. They found declines in such filings, quote, both in terms of the propensity to receive benefits and the benefit amount, end quote, in states that have enacted the policy change. Further, they identified complementary declines in non-traumatic workplace injury rates and the incidence of work-limiting disabilities in legal states. These findings run counter to arguments commonly made by prohibitionists, who claim that legalizing marijuana would lead to lower productivity and more occupational hazards and associated costs to businesses. We have studies going back to the 1960s and 70s that show that marijuana users are more productive and have less workplace accidents and injuries than non-smokers. However, that hasn't changed things until now. In fact, this study indicates that regulating cannabis sales for adults is a workplace benefit by enabling older employees between 40 and 62 years of age to access an alternative treatment option. Beyond decreasing workers' compensation claims and costs, legalization is also a boon to the economy by adding jobs in legal states. The cannabis industry added more than 77,000 new jobs over the past year, a 32% increase that makes the sector the fastest in job creation compared to any other American industry. Our last story tonight is very brief. There are now more than 900 cannabis, psychedelics, and drug policy bills active in state legislatures and the United States Congress this year. So keep working to restore hemp. I have a great honor to introduce someone who I have admired for many, many years, a real pioneer, one of what I would call original pioneers of cannabis reform, Mr. Michael Aldridge. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Hello there, Paul.
That's a lovely mask.
This lovely mask that was made for me by a friend of Debbie Goldsberry's over in Berkeley. It's a beautiful mask. And that's one of the ancillary industries that will be growing up as marijuana legalization grows.
That's true. That's true. Well, Michael, you have been an activist since before anyone else I've ever met. You know, I know people come to me and say, I'm the old time activist and nobody was out there before I was there. And I have to tell them, no, like Isaac Newton, if I saw any farther than others, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants. And
I was
so
not the first, however.
are one of the original giants in our movement. And I want to thank you for leading the way back when it was a dangerous thing to do. So
I was not the first to start an organization for legalization of marijuana. That was in 1964 when a young man in San Francisco named Lowell Eggemeyer marched into the police station, lit up a joint, and demanded to be arrested because he didn't think marijuana should be illegal. And he served a year in jail and disappeared from the movement after that. But his lawyer, James R. White III, started the very first LEMAR organization, LEMAR being legalized marijuana.
right.
And that was in San Francisco in 64. Allen Ginsberg was in Berkeley at the time, and he took the idea back to New York and started the New York LEMAR with Ed Sanders. Ed Sanders' bookstore, the Peace-Eye bookstore, was that was the center of the activities on the East Coast for many years. Plus a young man named Randy Wicker, who's everybody's forgotten, but he had a head shop. And he started a LEMAR in New York. And then John Sinclair was a good friend of Ed Sanders in Detroit. And John started one in Detroit and sent me, at my request, a whole pile of publications. He'd started putting out pamphlets and little one-sheet flyers and so forth for legalizing marijuana in both Detroit and Ann Arbor. And
Was that still in the 60s?
yeah, this is 66.
I know that John Sinclair, was arrested for the famous two joints, and John Lennon of the Beatles wrote a song about him.
That's
and
right.
It led to I think it was in 74. What?
Yeah, something like that. John and Yoko came and did a concert.
Court overturned the marijuana laws, and marijuana was legal for a month there.
Yeah, yeah.
But so he was part of LEMAR as well.
Yes, and when he sent me a whole pile of documents, I decided to start the very first college chapter of LEMAR. It was called SUNY at Buffalo LEMAR, which is where I was doing my graduate work for a PhD in marijuana. As it turned out, I got my PhD in marijuana. It was called Marijuana Myths and Folklore in 1970. I think it was the very first dissertation in the United States, anyway, about cannabis. So I'm very proud of that. I'd first turned on in 1963 when a lovely young lady named Betty, who was going to Harvard summer school with me, sat me down in the middle of Harvard Yard about 8 o'clock at night and dug in her purse and said, "Have you ever tried one of these?" and pulled out a real thin joint. At the time, you could tell where the joint was rolled by how thick it was. The New York joints were all pinners, very slim joints, and Chicago was hardly bigger. And then you got to LA and you got bombers that had a huge pile in the center, and you slowed them out. San Francisco had a fairly thick, straight joint. So you could tell where somebody grew up. John showed me that in Michigan, they always crimped one corner and folded the other. And so that was said to carry it in their pocket.
That's how I learned to roll my joints with we called it the boat. You'd put little indents both ends so it wouldn't spill out as easily.
And the San Francisco one was called the Golden Gate Bridge joint because it had two piles on the sides, and then you rolled those together to make a fairly straight joint. Quite interesting.
Yeah. So you first tried cannabis in Harvard Yard. That's pretty historic. And so
63.
So were you immediately enamored with it? It obviously led.
It helped that we were in bed an hour later. Did you hear that one?
What? No.
Helped a lot that we were in bed an hour later. in
That's
terms of
all
my
told,
introduction to marijuana. That was terrific. Listen, I'd like to point out the huge differences that have arisen since 1963. We didn't have pre-rolls. We were lucky if we got shitty Mexican weed, traveling all the way across the country, brought by various travelers. And by the time it reached Buffalo, it was full of seeds and stems. And we had to roll pretty thin joints ourselves. But at least, and then there were pipes and so forth. I
right.
think the part of the what's happening now and what will be continuing to happen in the future is the replacement of rolling your own with pre-rolls. And for instance, in San Francisco, we now have all kinds of pre-rolls being offered. This is Calm.
Yeah, that's
This one is called Granddaddy Purple, one of my very favorites. And so they come in packages that are variously hard to open, but they're all sealed up. There is no way that any bugs are going to get in there. And they come in packs like cigarettes. So I think that the trend of the future for the marijuana industry, here's another couple of packs,
yeah.
is going to be packs like cigarettes and selling individual pre-rolls. And I think it's going to be taken over by huge corporations.
Well,
And what's lacking is some way for the individual farmer or for the small family farms to survive in the face of huge corporations. And what we have now already growing up is gigantic international corporations. You see ads for them every day on CNBC, and huge corporations and all the ancillary industries such as books, magazines, clothing, food, drinks, edibles, CBD products. I might mention that a lot of the CBD products that are being marketed right now contain little or no CBD and have no effect other than the belief that they're going to have an effect. So it's a placebo effect as far as many of the CBD products. On the other hand, if you can get a really good CBD tincture or a THC tincture, my wife cured her lung cancer in 3.5 months using a THC tincture, sort of like Rick Simpson oil. And she was able to successfully cure her lung cancer. Her doctors were just amazed. I want to mention, of course, that I met my wife at the first National Normal Conference in 1972. And I invited her to come out and work on the California Marijuana Initiative, which is the first marijuana initiative on the ballot. And she showed up 2 weeks later, and we've been together every day ever since. Just a marvelous. We got married 5 years later in 1977.
You're coming up on what, your 60th anniversary, or?
Well, it's my 50th anniversary of smoking weed, and I think 48th anniversary of being with her, smoking weed with her.
Have been a guest tonight, but she had some gastrointestinal ailments, so she's just not up to it. So
when you think about all the ancillary industries that are going to be taken over by huge corporations, that includes pipes and rolling papers. And
so you don't know it, but I've actually had my company stolen by one of those huge corporations. You met our producer, Bill. Bill and I, as I told you, were chief petitioners on the marijuana legalization in Oregon. Well, some Canadians came in with forged documents, and I think by buying the judges, they took over our business in a preliminary injunction. So we demanded a jury trial, and I spent $170,000 on lawyers and went broke. They spent $2 million on lawyers, and I couldn't compete with that, but I still demanded a jury trial. And then they dismissed the case just before the jury trial. So now my only option to get my company back
is to get lawyers and sue them. But of course, I can't afford that. But get this, they took my company public on the Toronto Stock Exchange. It's part of the Kronos Group. The board of directors of the Kronos Group did this to me. So they brought in $10 million from George Soros before they took me over. And then it's public now on the Toronto Stock Exchange, and its value spiked up over $800 million Canadian, or over $500 million in US dollars. And so the business that I started and that Bill and I helped grow is now valued at over $500 million. The Marlboro Tobacco invested in the Kronos Group to the tune of 1.8 billion. And I only have about $4,000 worth of stock in that, out of that $500 million, even though I started it, trademarked the name, worked on it for 20 years. They stole it from me without paying me a penny and did it with, you know?
You're the big example of the small farmer who got taken over by the huge corporation, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's a tragedy. That is a personal story that I think is truly a tragedy.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it.
Think of all the stuff they have to do. They have to pay all these things. The big corporations have to pay taxes, licenses, permits, fees. And if they want to run their own initiative, they put their own initiative on the ballot. When we ran the 1972 marijuana initiative, it was 20,000 volunteers. We did not pay for any signatures. It cost us about $200,000, which we raised by selling Amorphia's rolling papers.
The marijuana initiative by selling marijuana rolling papers, right? There's a patent.
This was the Acapulco Gold pack.
Hold it up there, a little bit higher.
Yeah, there we go.
Kind of towards your face. There, I can see it now.
There, okay, there we go.
Yeah, so those are the Amorphia rolling papers. When did you first start selling those?
1972.
And then they helped fund
contributors
in the world to legalize marijuana in California in 72.
That's right.
You working in that campaign, what was you got like 30 some odd %, didn't you, for legalization?
30%, more than 30%, yes.
I thought it was like 34 or 35%, if memory serves me correct.
2 to 1.
Yeah.
We regard that as a great victory.
Yeah,
nobody ever points out that one third of the California electorate voted in favor of legalization in 1972. That blew our minds.
Yeah.
The first time it was ever on a ballot anywhere in the world, and it got a third of the vote. Well, George Moscone, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time in California, he understood that electoral count. I mean, nobody had ever seen those electoral votes, those votes for marijuana. So what he did was introduce in the legislature a bill called SB 95, which decriminalized the possession with a maximum $100 fine. And I wish that were still our law. It supposedly is on the books. But that has been, the result of that was that the initiative forced the legislature to do something. And that was important because it was all volunteers. It was truly a people's initiative. It was not paid for by these big corporations.
I think any other California initiative has done that in our lifetime, has it? They've all been paid. Been the only volunteer campaign to qualify for a vote.
Same year, 1972, was the Coastal Initiative, which cleaned the California coast and made it impossible for the developers to take away all our beaches. Just that simple. So what I'm saying is that the initiative process reflected the will of the people rather than the will of the corporations. And now what's happened is that the small farmer can't afford all the taxes and licenses and permits and endless greed on the part of the state governments and local governments. They all want to tax us.
And it's overregulated. There's this irrational fear of THC,
Right.
where THC's never killed anybody.
That's right. That is absolutely correct.
When a mother starts lactating or giving breast milk, the colostrum is endogenous THC. So a mother gives their baby a form of what people get when they smoke marijuana.
That's
So
correct.
be bad for your children, you
Yes.
know?
Esther Frieda, do you remember her name? She
Yes,
was a brilliant Israeli researcher. I met her at the Portland marijuana conference sponsored by Patients Out
I remember that.
very early also, maybe I can't remember the date. And Esther pointed out that mothers may have been not having enough marijuana in their system to produce that effect. And that was a startling revelation that marijuana not only did not harm children and babies, but it actually helped them in terms of getting fed, staying alive.
That's like Melanie Dreyer, the nurse who later taught at the University of Iowa. She did her study on Jamaica, what was it? Ganja in Jamaica.
That's right.
Showing that the birth weight of mothers who used marijuana or cannabis or ganja, the birth weight was about 10% higher for mothers who used cannabis compared to mothers who didn't.
Interesting.
And higher birth weights are associated with better health in babies generally.
Correct. Yes. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So
that's interesting turnaround then on the famous myth that marijuana harms children. And you have to put it in the closet and get a ladder to get it down out of the closet so your children can never see it. I say the other thing. I say teach your children how to smoke and use marijuana. What better source of information than the parents if the parents have been smoking marijuana? If they haven't, they know nothing. And maybe it's the kids who will teach the parents in that case.
yeah,
That would be my recommendation. It should be part of college classes, and it already is in some cases. There are universities that offer degrees in cannabisology or cannabinoidology or something like that. Like Oaksterdam University was the very first university devoted to cannabis. Not only that, but there will be night classes. There will be people enrolling in order just to take that class, or maybe people coming to San Francisco to take a really good class instead of what they might get in Arkansas or something.
Yeah.
Well, I see expansion as happening with a wonderful effect on the population of America and the world. Then there'll be world international contests. There'll be contests between whether Spain can grow the best dope or Georgia can grow the best dope. So I see this worldwide thing happening, and the hard part is that we need to help the small farmers survive the industrialization of this industry. We need to help the small farms. We need to have special licenses for farms that produce less than, say, I don't know, 10,000 plants or something. The smaller farms, we need to have reservations for people to be able to grow it at home or in their backyard. The slogan for Amorphia in 72 was, what we want is free legal backyard marijuana. That's what I told the National Commission on Marijuana in that year. And they were just shaking their heads. Free marijuana, legal marijuana. It was wonderful.
Appreciate your lifetime of education and leading the way. I worked on the second marijuana initiative. I moved to Oregon. Actually, I met our mutual friend, who I believe is also from Buffalo, New York, Jack Hare, the late great Jack Hare, in Los Angeles. in 1982. I did a brief voter registration job for Tom Hayden in Santa Monica in 72. And then I looked in the Yippie newspaper overthrow and found the Reefer Raiders. So I met Ed Adair and he introduced me to Jack Herer. But Jack also, and Ed and you all and Todd Micarea were some of the leaders in the 1972 initiative, weren't you?
Michelle Aldrich.
And Michelle, right.
Michelle was the main one
first
involved in that initiative.
That's the thing. I wanted to have Michelle on because women are so often marginalized. It's good to. So the next time, hopefully she'll feel better and feel up to it.
Other thing is that collectors should start collecting. If you haven't started collecting stuff yet, start now. These things are incredibly valuable. Here, for instance, I have a huge pipe collection. It's in one of the cabinets behind me there.
Yeah, it looks nice. That's a nice cabinet.
My favorites.
Ah.
See this?
Yeah.
This is called the beginner's pipe. The baby bottle with a nipple on the end and a bowl on the top. So that's your beginner's pipe.
So you also started the infamous Fitzhugh Ludlow Library. You want to
for many years. I was not the starter of the library. Michael Horowitz and Bob Barker and Bill Daly in LA were the founders of the Ludlow Library. I was its curator for 12 or 13 years. And we sold the collection to a Julio Mario Santo Domingo, who is a young Colombian man living in Paris. And he had a huge collection of rare drug books from Europe. And he just came and saw our collection. He was just astonished at it. And he bought the whole collection for $300,000, which at that time was a huge sum.
Yeah.
And took it back to Europe and organized it, brought Mike Horowitz over to catalog the whole thing, book by book by book, which ones were inscribed, which ones were not, which ones were first editions, and so forth. And by the time that he had it all figured out and put on cards and put on lists, he died of cancer suddenly, and he had no insurance policy for the library. So
that was the owner, Michael Horowitz, who passed away.
No. Julio Mario Santo Domingo passed away. No, Horowitz is very much alive. Thank you. We're correspondents daily.
Good.
He's up in Vancouver now.
So what happened to the collection in Paris?
Collection then got sold to Julio Mario Santo Domingo. When he died, he had made no arrangements for the library, but luckily his family had the good sense, rather than breaking it up and selling it, which would brought in millions of dollars, they donated the whole thing to Harvard University, to the whole rare book collection at Harvard. So we got wonderful videos of these curators at Harvard who are used to, going over 15th century manuscripts and looking at illuminations and ancient first editions and so forth. Here they are looking over Marijuana Girl and cataloging the Marijuana Girl and Reefer Madness just as well as they would catalog a 17th century illuminated manuscript. It was so wonderful, and they loved it. They had never seen such a collection. And the pulps, of course, are now extremely valuable. The value of pulps in the 50s and early 60s, extremely valuable now.
So if you're a researcher, you can go to Harvard and look over that collection. Wow.
Finest marijuana and other drug collections. There was a huge LSD section, a great big cocaine section, and a large opiate section. We specialized in first editions.
How many books were part of that?
Oh, probably 10,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have about 550, and I think I have a lot. But I didn't know it was so young. That's fascinating. I did not know the history of that. I just remember your name What was that?
I don't even have a list of mine.
Ah, I just remember you were the curator. Your name was always attached.
Yes. Uh-huh.
So tell us more about, so you met Michelle at the first normal meeting. How is it that you got drawn into the normal meeting? You're already doing Lamar and you're trying to do the initiative. Tell us more about that seminal time in the late 60s and early 70s, if you can.
There was a young man named Blair Newman, who I regard as a complete genius. He had an idea in two parts. He was in Washington, and I met him also at that normal conference. No, I'd met him earlier. That's right. I'd gone to Colorado to a conference and met Blair.
I
And
see.
his idea was twofold. One, we would sell Acapulco Gold rolling papers and use all the profits to finance legalization efforts. And that's what we actually did. We sold the marijuana rolling papers and used that money to pay for the financing of the first marijuana initiative in 1972. Then the second part of the idea was that in the future, when marijuana was legal, we would continue to sell marijuana legally and use that money to finance other initiatives, other causes that needed to be done and that could best be done by people's initiatives. So that was the grand plan. It worked out very well, except that the initiative process has now been taken over completely by large corporations. Oh, we applied for the first copyright on and trademark on the name Acapulco Gold. And we got the name trademarked for rolling papers, but not for the product itself. And the letter we got back from the patent office said simply that marijuana and cannabis and Acapulco Gold is the name of a type of marijuana, and it's a generic type of marijuana, and therefore it cannot be, the name can't be given to anyone. It's a generic name.
Didn't the tobacco companies come out with little cigars?
No, they tried and tried and tried, and they were ruled illegal as well for tobacco.
Ah, okay.
Very
Yeah, that is.
It's too
That
bad.
is.
It's too
That
bad.
is.
We more or less lost that Acapulco Gold trademark. We had to sell Amorphia when we went out of business, and we sold it to a young man named Ray Haas, who is part of the Haas. It's a very famous family in San Francisco area. And he put out his own little version of rolling papers called Acapulco Gold, and they're very rare. They're probably the rarest form of Acapulco Gold now. My point is that it has spread so far now that what we really need is to help the small farmer. We
I
need to
agree.
have things for them, particularly to encourage local people to grow their own, and for local businesses. The vision, of course, is driving up Highway 101, and just as you do with wineries, and you go in and you visit this farm, and you get a little sample to take home, and you purchase a pound or two, and you're off and to see the next farm. And that was my vision of what will happen. Instead, what you're going to have now is probably huge corporations showing you around their huge warehouses and their huge outdoor cultivation plots.
No, I agree. We've got to change that. We've got to, this is just horribly overregulated, and being overregulated is better than being thrown in jail, but only a little bit. We need the planet needs this plant to be completely legalized. All life on this planet will benefit if we can just get rid of this crazy prohibition and this irrational fear of THC.
One thing that has really helped during COVID, well, first of all, they're looking at some possible uses of cannabis in various forms for COVID-19. But otherwise, the idea of a pandemic being helped by marijuana use, even if it's marijuana use simply for reducing stress and tension and helping your own life and making you sleep better. I think what we're going to discover is that marijuana, as Todd McArea once said, has benefits for illnesses we haven't even discovered yet, illnesses we haven't even had the pandemic for. And that came out, of course, of marijuana helping AIDS wasting syndrome. Then they discovered it not only helped AIDS wasting syndrome, it reduced the HIV in your body. I mean, that's a lesson for what to do with cannabis worldwide during a pandemic.
I 100% agree. We had a nurse on a couple of weeks ago, Jana Champagne out of Medford, Oregon, who's been working with cannabis and changed the focus of her practice. But she sees that a lot of diseases like Alzheimer's and attention deficit, those were things that didn't exist until marijuana was made illegal. They weren't, recorded in medicine. So they're kind of like cannabis deficiency syndrome. It used to be cannabis was the most frequently prescribed substance.
In the 19th, yes.
And everybody ate hemp seed. We called it gruel. I look forward to being able to get a good bowl of gruel someday, but it doesn't sound that appealing. But
speaking of nurses, we should mention Mary Lynn Mathry and Al Byrne,
the founders of Patients Out of Time
Nurses Association. And they have drawn many, many, many public health nurses. And I'm wondering about all the, it's interesting that cannabis dispensaries were in San Francisco and throughout California regarded as essential industries. And they were allowed to open, and that we were the first, I think, the dispensaries were the very first to require masks before you get in the door. That was before grocery stores and before large corporations started doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are definitely a lot of health issues regarding this. So tell us how you first got involved with Jack Herer and that crew.
Jack showed up at the 1972 Marijuana Initiative office in Los Angeles. He had short hair. He was wearing an Army military shirt. He'd just gotten out of the Army. And he came over to the CMI office, the initiative office, and volunteered to help. And he knew about marijuana. He turned on Captain Ed as soon as he found out about marijuana, but he had never seen rolling papers. So I showed him a pack of hemp rolling papers, the Acapulco Gold rolling papers.
And he hemp paper.
Yeah. He looked at it and he said, "You mean there's something else you can do with marijuana besides smoke it?" That started a whole industry. He sure took that idea and ran with it.
That's quite historic. Yeah, he had a history of going town to town doing sales jobs, and he created the hemp tour with his book and went town to town selling his book and educating. That's how Goldsberry first got involved.
We edited the first edition of Jack's book, The Emperor.
I remember that. So, what what's the latest thing for you guys? I know you created a music video recently with someone. Can you tell our audience about that?
Well, Damian Marley did a music video of Michelle. Talking about her curing her lung cancer with cannabis. He interviewed her for a whole hour, and that was in regard to the song, which is Medication Makes Me High. A brilliant song. I love that song. Collecting cannabis music is another collector's item. There's millions of cannabis songs, many people have gone back and looked at the old Cannabis songs. The first one, well, one of the first ones was Louis Armstrong's Muggles. And
Right.
Muggles was famous because it was one of the very first jazz improvisation songs. He plays the melody for the first three choruses, and then when Louis Armstrong comes in, he plays the melody in his first chorus, and then the second chorus, which is the final chorus, he takes it way far away from the melody, way high into the treble clef, and just toodles his way. It was such good improvisation that every musician wanted to try marijuana.
Well, they already were, probably. That was the thing about it. It wasn't like he was the only one at the time. It was, I mean, Calloway had the song "If You're a Viper," right? That was,
and
was
yep. And also, Michelle and I then were hired by the National Commission on Marijuana Research. By that commission in '72, someone who was working as a consultant for them hired us to make a list of marijuana songs. And so we went through all my record collection. I have a huge LP record collection. Every time I see marijuana on an album, I buy it. That's still today. And we went through my record collection and cataloged every song. We told whether it was for marijuana, against marijuana, or neutral, simply describing the effects of marijuana. And whether it was what? And whether it was conjectural marijuana, like Puff the Magic Dragon, that's right. That could be only conjectural as a marijuana song. And in fact, Peter, Paul, and Mary said it was Puff the Magic.
But they didn't write it, right? It was someone else that wrote it, so they don't really know.
Incredible area of the world music about cannabis.
Yeah. Yeah, there is, and there are more songs all the time. I collect some of them, but it's just amazing how it's all across the world too. This is something that goes back, I hold that we have co-evolved with cannabis for at least 25,000 years, and that cannabis has changed us and we have changed cannabis.
I like
that.
And
that and we need that evolution to continue, especially with regard to replacing petroleum products with hemp seed oil and hemp biomass, replacing deforestation with hemp fiber. Those are things that are critical to all life on this planet. And hemp is
energy you want in terms of a marijuana field without harming the environment. In fact, growing marijuana helps the environment. It helps the soil.
That's right. It helps rebuild it.
The thing that we've been doing most recently is 5 years after Amorphia closed, the IRS contacted us and wanted us to pay income tax. What? Champ, I'm sorry. Champ was a dispensary that I was the director of. And 5 years after it closed, IRS sued us to try to make us pay all these back taxes for a company that had long since gone under.
Is that the same one involving Mary Lynn Mather? No, not Mary Lynn Mather.
No, 280E is the first. The first one that came after was us.
Yeah.
What they wanted. So what we did is countersued them. We sued them. We became the prosecutors of the DEA, saying that 280E was unconstitutional and impossible to enforce, and moreover that if we had conformed to what they wanted, they would have. I went over every line of our tax return for the year they wanted the extra money. And I showed that every one of those were business expenses, except for the about 10% of our location was given over to selling marijuana. And the other 90% of the location was chairs and tables where people could sit and smoke and talk with each other. It was a social gathering place. And the judge heard that very much. He said that my testimony was very acute and was some of the most intelligent he'd ever heard in regard, especially to cannabis. And he ruled that we had to pay taxes on 10% of our revenue because that 10% went for paychecks. And the other 90% went for social services. We did not have to pay taxes on social services. So that set the precedent, which every IRS suit since then has tried to break. They've the Harborside and all the other big ones on the matter of 280E, charging them zillions of dollars in taxes and hoping to break the precedent that Champ set. It's called the Champ 280E decision if you want to Google it.
What year was that? What year?
7, I think. 97, 90, I can't remember what
That's
year.
okay. Google will probably have that there.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. You know, the IRS is still.
What?
Oh, I was saying the IRS.
Last thing I would like to say is I am delighted that people like you are helping get the word out. I mean, you have lots and lots of viewers, and so does everybody else that talks about cannabis. I'm just amazed. Every day now there's a program about cannabis, either on CNBC or one of the regular news stations. They're having hour specials. They're showing the way it's done in various different places, and that's all to the good.
Yeah.
So remember my words, help the small farmers. And we'll end with that.
Okay. Well, let's just go ahead and wrap it up then. I really appreciate you coming on. Michael, we'll have to have you come back on when Michelle's feeling a little bit better. So
Good.
again, I want to thank you for your lifetime of dedication to our mutual cause. And it's a real pleasure to do this show with you here.
And the real blessing was that's how I met my lovely wife.
Indeed, indeed. And I met you guys at the Normal Conference in San Francisco. I think it was 93 or 94 or something like that. We went to Garrett Deli Square and was it the Manchurian
Yeah.
When I put the conference together and
It
Dennis
was-
got the credit
Michelle's
for it.
telling me it was 92 when she put the conference together and Dennis Perone got the credit for it.
I remember that she had put it together indeed.
I
But
think that's the first
thank you guys for everything.
Muggles.
That's where we introduced medical marijuana to the issue.
And we introduced medical marijuana to the issue.
All right. And now the world has changed, and hopefully for the better.
Thank you, Paul.
Michael, thank you to Michelle as well. And for our audience, you see that there's more work to do. We got to protect the small farmers and help restore hemp. Good night,
Thank you.
Michael.